welcome to South by Southwest 2021s, and this is a panel on the perils of deplatforming. Whatever that word means, which we will get into quite a bit. I'm joined by four genuine experts on this. My name's Ben Smith. I'm the media columnist for the New York Times, I'm the opposite of deplatformed in that role. But I'm joined by four people who find themselves constantly on the brink of deplatforming. And I guess I wondered if you would each just quickly introduce yourselves rather than my attempting to introduce you, starting with Kate.
Hi, I'm Kate Ruwan, Senior Legislative Counsel for the American Civil Liberties Union. In that role, I serve mostly to engage in advocacy towards Congress, but I also work on platform issues as well.
Emranath? Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Religion, cross-appointed. I'm the assistant professor in the School of Religion, cross-appointed to political studies, and I mostly work on terrorism, which naturally gets me drawn into deplatforming issues as well.
Stephen?
Hi, everybody. My name is Stephen Rosenbaum. I'm the executive director of the NYC Media Lab, which is a consortium of universities in New York. And, you know, we have found ourselves in this really interesting place because we have technology partners and we have publishing partners and we have students and faculty. And depending on who you talk to, they feel very, very, very strongly about this issue in totally different ways. And so I hope that I'm going to be a little bit Switzerland in this conversation, but don't count on it.
Okay, and I think, Jillian, yes.
Yeah.
Who are you?
Hi, I'm Jillian York. My title was actually too long to put in there, so I'm not the director, but I'm the director for international freedom of expression at the
Jillian,
EFF.
Can you introduce yourself real quick?
I think we have a delay. Okay. Hi, I'm Jillian York. I'm not actually the director. I'm the director for international freedom of expression at the EFF, or Electronic Frontier Foundation. And we're one of the world's oldest digital rights organizations. And I'm also the author of this forthcoming book, Silicon Values, the Future of Free Speech Under Surveillance Capitalism, which talks a lot about deplatforming from the standpoint of big tech companies.
Thanks. And if anybody else has a book, feel free just to kind of hold it up at any point in this. And I guess to begin with, I think I'll start with you, Jillian, and there's some little delay here that we'll have to navigate. But I think, you know, when we talk about deplatforming, that means a lot of different things to different people. It can mean a government, you know, silencing someone. It can mean like the people who run the infrastructure of the web, the pipes of the web, like Amazon throwing them off. It can mean a private company like Twitter or Facebook deleting somebody's account. It can mean people yelling at someone when they speak at a college. And so I wonder if you can sort of talk through how you see, what do you think the word means before we get started?
Sure. So I think that the word does mean all of those things. I first heard the term a couple of years ago when the discussion was being had about the deplatforming of speakers at UK universities, which is really the boycott. And for me, deplatforming or cancel culture, or whatever we want to call it in that context, is actually a form of speech itself. It's counter speech. It's the pushing back against someone else's speech. That doesn't mean that it's never problematic, but it's a very different situation than when we have a big tech company, whether it's an infrastructure company like Amazon, or a more speech hosting company like Twitter, and we can talk about those differences maybe. And it's certainly different from the power that a state wields in censoring the internet or censoring a newspaper or an individual, which I'm sure we'll come back to as well.
And before we go further, actually, a quick show of hands. Who here thinks Twitter made the right call in throwing Donald Trump off? All right. So good. I'm glad Amarnath is like doing the weird shaky hand thing because I actually would like to start with you because you were very involved and I think truly like one of the real experts on maybe the least controversial deplatforming of the modern era, which is when the platforms got serious about tossing ISIS off. And I wonder if you could both tell that story a little. And I'm curious whether it still seems quite as straightforward, or maybe it didn't seem quite so straightforward then as a decision.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so, 2011, the Syrian revolution begins. A lot of people start to leave from Western countries to go fight with groups like ISIS and other rebel groups. And what we immediately noticed, of course, was that a lot of these second generation young people who were going to fight would land in Syria and basically keep their social media accounts active. And so they'd be tweeting about their breakfast. They'd be talking about, posting pictures of the battlefield on Facebook and Tumblr and, Instagram and so on. And it became kind of a home for them for several years until late 2015-ish, when I think enough international pressure was put on these platforms to start to actually do something. It was much easier, I think, to take down ISIS content, because a lot of ISIS media is branded, and so each of their media arms, the English language media arm, the Arabic media arm, all have a little nice logo in the top corner, and so when platforms started to automate takedowns, they used a lot of those kinds of things, like the ISIS media brand, to take down content. And a lot of the fighters and supporters who were on these platforms started to disappear, right? Started to get taken down. There's more to the story, but I think what was it was, I say, a kind of easier decision, because I don't think there are many people who say, yeah, we should totally have beheading videos of journalists on Twitter. And so the takedown of some of that content wasn't really debated. And so as ISIS moved to more fringe platforms like Telegram and so on, the far right basically just continued in some of these mainstream platforms without much debate until fairly recently, when people like Laura Loomer and Milo and all of these people started to get deplatformed, and I found that them getting taken down was also very similarly not really debated, right? Even though it wasn't exactly the same caliber of content as ISIS videos or beheading videos, and so there wasn't much debate on that front, and so many of them started to also disappear and going into more fringe platforms like Telegram, and so I think but the far right is much more difficult because it's a much more nebulous movement. It's not necessarily branded. We don't know what there's no brand, there's no logo for the far right, and so the kind of things that qualify as ready to be taken down or should be taken down is much more difficult. I guess the second problem, of course, is that the far right has massive support, unlike ISIS, in regular people, voting blocs, governments, political parties in Europe, the Prime Minister of India, so all of these things become much more difficult to navigate on the far right space than it ever was on the ISIS, jihadist, Al-Qaeda space.
And Kate, so I guess I wonder, sort of as as the people famous for helping the Nazis march through Skokie, like at what point do the alarm bells about this start ringing at the ACLU? Like, are you when you see the ISIS beheaders get knocked off, are you calling them and offering your legal counsel? When it's Milo, like at what point, or if at any point, do you start to sort of feel like, okay, maybe I personally don't like this speech, but this is starting to become a speech issue?
So I mean, a couple things, right? Like when it comes to deplatforming off of social media platforms, we're actually not talking, at least in the United States, about a legal position. We're talking about a normative one, because you do not actually have a First Amendment right to your Twitter account. It is Twitter's First Amendment right that is at issue when it is making its decisions about who is on its platform and who isn't. But that being said, the closer we get to a company providing access to the internet, the more important it is that that company be neutral, viewpoint neutral, in its provision of service. So when we're talking about, broadband internet access services, the ACLU firmly believes that they can be legally subject to something we call net neutrality principles. The further away you get from that, the less likely it is that you can impose that legally. But as a normative matter, it is very important for platforms like Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, that are responsible for the speech of billions of people around the world, to be avoiding censorship to the extent that they can, because they are gatekeepers to the public square. And when they moderate content, they often get it wrong. That said, when we get to, ISIS beheading videos, no one supports that being on a platform, and neither the ACLU does not take issue with removing videos like that. The question gets harder when you get, I think, to some of the examples that Amarnath was bringing up, where the far right has a fair amount of political support, and the movement is pretty nebulous, and so it is difficult to say where the line actually is in censorship. But for the ACLU, it is, we should try to avoid deplatforming, censoring, removing speech from the platform, and instead try to find other ways to address these issues.
Julian.
I hate to be that guy, but I don't support the majority of ISIS content being allowed online. But it's not. I don't agree with the suggestion that no one has brought this up. For several years now, Syrian Archive in particular, as well as a number of other groups, have been concerned, and have expressed this to YouTube and the other platforms, that they are taking down core human rights documentation from Syria in particular. And, ISIS is the perpetrator of some of that. Some of it is coming from the Syrian government as well. But there is a case to be made, even if that material should not be allowed to be publicly posted, that it still should be documented in some way. And the vast majority of it is thrown in the bin of history by content moderators. And that, to me, is a real problem.
I'm slightly disappointed you weren't just taking a pro-ISIS position, because that would have made this more exciting.
But I will make a case for Hezbollah if you want me to.
I just want to say Jillian's absolutely right, and that's true, and it's true of the Capitol attack as well, right? We're seeing so much evidence, we're seeing so much documentation of what happened on January 6th being removed from the internet entirely, with no sense of whether we will be able to preserve it for research value or for historical value at all.
And I think, one of the big questions, obviously, is just who's going to make these decisions. Like, we're sort of talking as though about, what's normatively right, without any clear sense of who's in charge. And I guess, Stephen, I'm sort of interested in that you're to some degree an industry guy, although you have a lot of stakeholders. Is this should this be a government decision? Should it be the CEOs of these companies acting unilaterally? Should it be some new transnational institution like this Facebook super court they're trying to set up that makes these decisions?
So I would start with kind of an overarching statement about all of these platforms, which I think is important to say. And that is that, disturbing content that is as far in any direction and as graphic as possible is a great business model. It drives the algorithm. People are drawn to it. It's the definition of driving by a car accident and craning your neck. And the problem with going after Twitter or going after YouTube or going after Facebook individually is, what they would tell you privately is, look, we're all on the same playing field here. And it makes an enormous, people want it. It's content people want. And so we're going to offer it. And Tristan Harris was on our stage back in October and gave a really compelling talk about the difference between freedom to speak and freedom to be amplified. And so a lot of, I think, the issue has to do with these companies being asked some broader philosophical questions about whether or not the amplification of objectionable content is a business model that they support. And so I don't like government as a manager of speech. I don't particularly think any of these companies are going to do anything to improve moderation or limiting. They're going to play whack-a-mole, which is impossible. I do think, and this may get me in trouble with the panel, but both the Democrats and the Republicans agree on one thing, which is that something has to change in Section 230, and then they kind of diverge about what that is. But part of what I like about rethinking Section 230 as the answer to this question is, what essentially makes it into is a lot of really, really sharply worded lawsuits. And not that I think that, lawsuits are a good thing, but I think that in some ways, making it a broader conversation as opposed to trying to say, Parler is bad, Trump is bad, so we'll take them down. That seems like a case for things getting worse before they get better.
And Kate, there is so much conversation about Section 230, which really and often, in Section 230, as I understand it, allows platforms to delete certain things without making them liable for everything else. That's probably not if I take from your facial expression, that's not a great legal summary. But I think there aren't actually serious policy proposals which are just sort of remove it and see what happens. But I think there are arguments about liability and amplification, all sorts of other things. What do you see as there are, as Stephen says, there are all these legislators in Washington mumbling about Section 230. What do you see as the actual choice here, policy-wise?
The actual choice with respect to 230, or the actual choice for how to deal with?
Well, maybe the choice is leave it alone and do something else, but the kind of the sort of concrete legislative choices facing people, rather than the kind of normative, what should we do?
So concrete legislative choices, if we're going to involve 230, I think need to do a couple things. First, I think we need to make sure that changing 230 would solve the problem we're trying to address. And often, I think on both sides, that's actually not what's going to happen. Instead, either we're talking about something that even if you did fix 230, the First Amendment protects, even if you did remove 230's protections for the speech, the First Amendment is what would actually wind up protecting it and preventing liability. Or, if changing 230 would address it, the other external effects of what changing 230 would do would create additional harms. So those are things that I want to think about, like changing 230 for hate speech or for white supremacist speech. That's 99.999% of that is protected, right? So if we make the companies liable for that, they're probably not going to be. But if we do remove the liability shield and open them up to lawsuits, these companies, especially the big ones that can do a lot of content moderation, that can build AI algorithm, that can build AI that will identify, speech that is bad or could create a liability risk, they will build those programs and just run them automatically, and there will be no human review of it. And what's going to happen is far, far more over moderation than anybody intends. And the way that is going to work is that it is going to, as it always has in the past, harm marginalized communities, speech that is outside what is deemed to be in the mainstream. And speech like that is speech that we want. Speech like that, we don't get marriage equality without speech like that. We don't get Black Lives Matter without speech like that. And incentivizing the eradication of that speech on the platforms by opening them up to a bunch of lawsuits that they just don't want to deal with, I think it's probably a mistake. So legislatively, what I would want to do is start, and I don't think that this is a panacea or a total fix to the problem. But what I would want to do is start with consumer data privacy legislation. Actually go after the business model of these companies, which is to collect your data and market you as the product, as opposed to marketing Facebook or Twitter. That's not their business model. Their business model is to market their users. So if we could interrupt that, if we could take a step towards interrupting that, I think that is a step in the right direction.
And I do think, so much of this is around, what liberals think would be good policy. That's where a lot of this conversation is had. And I think, or people, liberals are not the only people who are upset about ISIS, obviously, or about white supremacists. But basically taking a group that there's some consensus is a nightmare and trying to throw them off the internet. And I guess I'm curious if there are lessons from ISIS, because that in some ways is just the absolute clearest example. And in the sort of, I think, narrative of people who only live on Twitter, at least, it's wow, Twitter banned them. And I don't know, I stopped paying attention for a little while. Next thing I knew, the Syrian army was retaking Raqqa, and that's probably because Twitter banned them. I'm curious if there are sort of policy lessons from that or from other cases you've studied about. Does throwing people off mainstream platforms, pushing them to Telegram, does that have the desired effect? What is the effect?
I mean, the main effect we noticed from ISIS was that the difficulty of kind of new people to the movement, I guess, being able to be in direct communication with people in Syria, high-level members of ISIS who were also very active on Twitter. And so the ability to just DM people and be given a phone number for a smuggler and be given a route into the conflict zone, all of that kind of stopped, right? And so you had to kind of be fairly dedicated already to then follow them to Telegram and know how to find them on Telegram. And so this kind of random ability to stumble across content and stumble across fighters basically came to an end, so to speak. And so you didn't, because there were a lot of cases of 14, 13-year-old girls in the US and in Europe who were the only reason some of them traveled to Syria was because they were in these kind of deep relationships with these fighters in the online space. And so this online community element became quite powerful. But I mean, to a lot of people's point that have spoken so far, I think the response to ISIS, built this kind of infrastructure known as the GIFCT, or the Global Internet Forum for Counterterrorism, where a lot of platforms, Microsoft, Google, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, all share what's known as the hash database, right? And so when an ISIS video, it gets turned from a glossy video into a bunch of ones and zeros, which are then uploaded onto this hashing database. And so if I try to upload that video, I'm stopped at the upload stage, right? And so I'm not allowed to upload that video anymore. Same thing happened with the Brenton Tarrant shooting video in Christchurch. That got put into the hashing database. And so any attempt to even upload that video is stopped right at the gates. And so that kind of system, the GIFCT system, plus kind of the kind of susceptibility of mass reporting to some of this content has had effect, as Jillian was saying. I mean, I have a friend who tried to set up a Black Lives Matter page in a city near Toronto, and it was taken down. I have a friend, a lot of activist friends in India right now who are part of the farmers movement. A lot of their accounts are being taken down, mainly because the Indian government is employing basically bots to mass report content. And so there are kind of holes in this kind of approach to say, okay, just report content to us and we'll take it down. Well, what happens if a government sets up a 8 million bot reporting system to take down all of your activist content? And so, there are consequences to the systems that we build that can then be exploited to take apart activist networks, as we've already been seeing. BLM, Antifa, we saw what happened in Myanmar a couple of years ago, and so that's all the consequences of this kind of approach, I guess, to terrorism. That's also been part and parcel of what we've witnessed. So it's not all benevolent.
Yeah. And I'm curious, right? I think Kashmir and then India are sort of, I've been sort of obsessed with that story from afar, because it's both this kind of mass reporting and government action against journalists. And then they say, look, this person's a criminal, take their account down. And they are obviously using tools that the US companies developed against and first terrorism. And Jillian, I'm curious I don't know if your remit extends outside the US, but if you see the sort of risks, just the way some of these ideas are being used by authoritarian regimes, by kind of not democracies like India that aren't that into rights.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to go back to one thing that Amarnath said before I answer that, which is I completely agree, but I also think, the GIFCT partnered with the Christchurch call. I forget the full name of it, a couple years ago, and I'm on the GIFCT transparency working group, just for full disclosure. But one of the things that we've seen with that is all of this money then poured into it, but they're still really singularly focused on ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and they haven't done much work on right-wing extremism at all, even though it's part of their remit. So again, I think we have to be really careful what we wish for with these things. But to go back to your question, I mean, yes, right now we're seeing some really interesting things happen in India and Myanmar. And I think it's the next few days, we should all be watching what the Indian government does, because they could just choose to block Twitter at this point. And it would be really interesting to see what would happen if they did that. We know from back, 10, 12 years ago that when we saw Turkey and Thailand block YouTube, we saw Tunisia block Facebook in 2008 before the Arab Spring, and it resulted in street protests that got Facebook unblocked. So there is a lot of cat and mouse there too. That sort of thing hasn't happened in a while, namely because these platforms are profitable in a lot of these countries. And yet we have seen governments, particularly Turkey, that's a really big one, massive e-commerce market, and the Turkish government just sends files and files and pages to all of these companies to take content down. And in most cases, these companies readily comply, even when that content is not within Turkish law, even when it violates international human rights norms. And a lot of the institutions that have been set up to monitor this, like the Global Network Initiative, have completely failed at their jobs to make sure that these companies are in line with international norms.
I mean, why should a company, that's a company in a national context, not follow national laws?
Well, because they committed to. So these companies all signed agreements more than a decade ago through the Global Network Initiative that they would not take down content that it violated international human rights norms. Now, mind you, there's plenty of stuff that would fall within Article 19 that would not, that's different than the way the First Amendment would govern it. So governments around the world that are party to the ICCPR do have the right and the ability to take down stuff that is, that qualifies as hate speech or incitement under a certain very specific test, stuff that puts a threat to public order. So there is a lot more breadth there with what they can do. But these companies agreed to, to fall in line with that many years ago. And most of them haven't, and most of them have suffered no consequences for not doing so. So, I mean, that's a little bit different than the broader question, why should they? Of course, not just because they agreed to it, but also because, this is a globalized internet, whether we like it or not. And it's not the borderless world that John Perry Barlow conceived of, but it's nonetheless a global space where we all, it is kind of in some ways still a great equalizer. It allows me to be in touch with all of you right now, unfortunately, in the same way that it allows ISIS to recruit young people. So it's always going to be a double-edged sword.
Can I jump in?
We're going to be planning extremist attacks immediately after this session. Stephen?
Yeah. So I want to put a little perspective on the tech guy part of this. So a couple of years ago, I was running a left-leaning but mostly moderate political network on Facebook, and we had an article that had a graphic, and the graphic had in it a swastika. It was relevant to the story. It wasn't meant to be an extremist symbol. It got caught by the algorithm and got taken down. And I went to the most senior person I knew at Facebook, who was in the top 7 or 8 executives, and said, hey, this is a mistake. We're a news organization and we've been on your network a while and this has to get put back up. And he said to me, you have no idea how hard that will be. It will take me at least, there will be 10 meetings. It will take at least 4 days. And by the time I get it back up, I will use an enormous amount of political capital to get that done. And by the time it gets back up, it won't be relevant to your story anymore. And I said to him, well, how did the algorithm determine, was it simply a shape that it, and he said, this thing that has haunted me and I've lost sleep over, he said, we honestly don't know. He said, it's a black box and we give it a lot of parameters about things we're unhappy about, and it behaves and it takes things down, and overriding that algorithm within this company is virtually impossible. So when they get going, Jillian, to your point, when they get a sheet from the government of all of these URLs and they feed that in through the whatever the opposite of a paper shredder is, here's a bunch of URLs, and the robot goes and goes blah, 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 blah. Like to fight to get any of those put back up is virtually impossible. And part of that is, I think people forget the sheer volume of inputs that are going into these places. Like, when you talk about the solution being content moderation, these are vendors. Like, they're not even employees. They're low-level vendors sitting outside reading a manual that's 500 pages thick about what to do if they see that image. And many of these calls are not simple. So, I mean, it's a mess.
Yeah.
The effect it has on counter speech is massive too. I mean, I said earlier that I was going to defend Hezbollah. I'm not going to do it exactly, but to give an example, I mean, they're an interesting case because they're both a U.S. designated terrorist group and a state actor. They've got seats in parliament in Lebanon. So whenever these companies take down content there from that one group, they're essentially deciding which political parties are valid in a sovereign nation. That to me is huge. But the example that I was going to say, really similar to Stephen's, is that there was a famous case maybe I think it's more famous than it is, but a case a few years ago where somebody had posted a picture of Hassan Nasrallah with the LGBT rainbow flag pasted over his face as a joke about, kind of a sardonic joke about how Hezbollah does not support LGBT rights, but the left supports them and blah, blah, blah. And that got taken down. He couldn't get it put back up. And this was a major journalist. So that's important counter speech or satire or both. And that's who it affects the most in a lot of these cases.
Jillian, do you anticipate, I think that Ben Thompson has sort of argued that these problems are going to sort of fade because you're going to have a fragmentation where social media platforms are going to be controlled in some way by national governments. And it was hard to build Twitter 10 years ago. It's actually pretty easy to build Twitter now. And they'll just, the Russians and the Turks and everybody will just build their own platforms. Do you think that's a likely outcome?
I think so. A couple things. One is back to Kate's point. If these reforms to Section 230 go through, one of the things we're going to see is a lot less room for competition, at least within the US. And I think that that's a really bad thing because we don't want just Facebook, right? I think that that's a bad idea. I don't want Facebook at all, to be perfectly honest. But I also think
Instagram, though.
Maybe.
Yeah, I was going to say your elderly relatives are upset to hear that.
Fair enough. Yeah, but I mean, one of the things with regulation that we're already seeing is, the German government put through the NetzDG or Network Enforcement Act a couple years ago to try to get rid of hate speech. And people on the left in the US are always like, oh, it's so great. You don't have Nazis on Twitter in Germany, but I'm in Germany and that's not true at all. And second, this law has been copied by a bunch of other governments, but in far worse versions. So just the past month, we saw it happen in Turkey. Right now in Indonesia, the MR5 law is one of the worst pieces of regulation I've ever seen. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of this in Europe as well. So the fragmentation is already ongoing, and it's hitting, again, people who are in the global south far worse than it's hitting folks in Europe and elsewhere.
Okay, so it's actually statutorily required that we spend the last third of this talking about Donald Trump. So, Stephen, to begin with you, briefly tell me why you're so excited Donald Trump got tossed off Twitter and Facebook.
I didn't realize the emotional toll that his tweets and then the spin out that wrapped around them was taking on my mental health. It was I would wake up in the middle of the night and doom scroll on my phone. That's just not healthy. And don't get me wrong. When I put my hand up, knowing that the consequences of being enthusiastic about that were probably not good for the conversation about the internet broadly. But he had a press room. He had access to the national and international press. He had no shortage of ways to transmit his message, whatever that was. And I didn't realize. So I half and jokingly, I wrote a piece for Media Post mid-fall in which I wrote an open letter to Jack Dorsey and told him that he needed to get out of his chair and take this thing down. And it went and take Trump down. And Trump was taken down the next day. So I take some pride in that. Jack listened to me, which is that being said, though, I find it fascinating that post Twitter, he's made no attempt to use it. He hasn't been on Fox News. He hasn't been calling into Hannity. He hasn't doing Maria Bartiromo. He isn't, writing an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. It is fascinating to me that mechanism of short, high distribution, kind of low volume tweet, like as a tool, it was uniquely effective for his kind of bile and misinformation in a way that I don't think any of us could have imagined. And I don't think other people will be able to use it as effectively.
Can I just add?
So on one side of the ledger, we have Stephen's sleep, and on the other, I guess I remember you initially kind of went like that, Amarnath. So what's the other side of the ledger?
Yeah, for me, I agree with most of that. I think part of me puts on my sociologist hat and thinks about his kind of charismatic position in the country, right? Like the United States hasn't really had a charismatic leader in the sense that Trump functioned. I don't know, probably since Kennedy or something, because that's the one that people always point to. But I think his ability to kind of command a following, his ability to critique the system that he himself was a part of, and his attempt to kind of mobilize people is not something I've seen before in the U.S. And so in that sense, I think his Twitter account, for all the reasons that Stephen was saying, was particularly dangerous. Yeah, I mean, he the kind of level of fact checking that he would have to go through to use his proper megaphone, he avoided for that reason, because he knew he could mobilize people directly through these kinds of tweets. And so I don't know if I support a full permanent lifetime ban, but I did believe that in between the election and in between the inauguration, having him on Twitter was quite dangerous, and then was basically proven right, or a lot of us were proven right by January 6th. And so I did think that kind of pivotal period, and I don't even know why the US has this massive gap in between the election and taking office, but anyway, that particular period was quite dangerous, and I think deplatforming him and some others in his administration temporarily was, I think, you could defend it from a public safety point of view. But I'm not sure I support like just taking him off entirely for the rest of his life. But I can be convinced out of that.
Well, yeah, I think, you know, the Facebook Supreme Court is setting to rule on a permanent ban. What makes you nervous about that?
I mean, probably for some of the reasons that Jillian has mentioned. I think I don't know. It makes me nervous that a head of state is deplatformed. I guess I don't know. I don't know if I have any smart thoughts on that, but I do. It just something about it doesn't sit well. But I do believe that his kind of temporary ban can probably be defended from a public safety point of view.
What do you think, Kate, about the notion of the permanent ban? Or is this not a speech issue because it's a private company?
I mean, it's definitely a speech issue because of the platforms that banned him, right? Because they are responsible for the speech of so many people. And I do think when it comes to public figures like Donald Trump or any other head of state, there are other interests and equities at issue when you decide whether to deplatform them, including, you know, government transparency and accountability. Getting rid of his entire Twitter history. Like, where is it? We need that. It's evidence. We used it. The ACLU used his Twitter account through his entire presidency as reference points, as evidence points.
Well, I mean, you know, we're not taking away your screenshots.
Well, I mean, but like getting back to whether we support it or I think that deplatforming Trump at the moment they did was defensible. Right. It was defensible. There were significant public safety equities in front of the platforms when they made those decisions. Whether it should continue for a lifetime, I don't know. But what the decision highlighted for me with respect to Trump himself was, so now that we are at this moment where every single lever at the federal government is about to change hands of power, now is when we're going to deplatform him. When, you know, the behavior he was exhibiting, the things that he was saying, he had been saying all along. There wasn't really much of a difference in Trump's rhetoric online or offline, but now something had changed. And I think that what that highlighted for me and why we pointed toward the kind of unchecked power of these large platforms is, you know, they are not consistent. They are not transparent. They do not provide clear rules that are not viewpoint based. And they don't allow all of the rest of us to have clarity for the ways that the rules are applied. They don't allow us to easily challenge when we are silenced, which has, you know, harmful effects on us. And because they haven't engaged in consistent transparency and accountability all along, it creates a certain feeling of randomness when somebody like Donald Trump is finally deplatformed. And like that to me is something that is a huge issue that we have, like the ACLU, EFF have been trying to get the platforms to deal with for a long, long time. And it is not clear to me why they don't. So that's what I thought. What I thought of deplatforming Donald Trump. Like the specific circumstance, I understood. But, you know, if they had been doing what we had asked them to do all along, it may not have created the sort of firestorm that it did.
The Facebook has this, I mean, I think Facebook seems to think they have the solution to your problem, which is this kind of new global super court. They put $130 million into something called the Facebook Oversight Board, which is this kind of like, it sort of feels to me like one of those sort of unexplained governments in a sci-fi movie where you have all these people like sitting around, this sort of very diverse group sitting around a glowing table wearing like kind of reflective suits. And, but also is full of genuinely serious people. And I think it was created by quite smart law professors who think this is the solution. I'm curious, does anyone think that's a good idea or a real solution? All right, Jillian, you were the most enthusiastic.
All right. Well, I'm glad you didn't ask me because Kate made all the points that I was going to make except about Trump, except Schadenfreude, I think was my feeling. So on the Facebook Oversight Board, so yes, I mean, I think that it is a really interesting idea and it's something that we haven't tried yet. So let's give it a shot. On the other hand, they intentionally made it 25% US Americans, which is not at all reflective of Facebook's user base. There are a number of people on that board that I'm pretty sure have never used Facebook in their entire lives. There's only 3 people on that board that I would consider content moderation experts, none of them from the US, incidentally. And so I do think that it's an interesting idea. I think that the devil's in the details, which I should overuse a phrase, but really they've failed on a number of points. The mandate is a little problematic in the sense that it doesn't really provide any kind of, what we'd consider traditional case law. Decisions do not necessarily trickle down. And so they can make this decision about Trump. And to be clear, I'm not sure that I got to read it again, but I'm pretty sure that the decision they're making is not about whether the permanent ban is right. I don't think Facebook's ban is permanent, but whether they made the right example in the first place. And so I think that, it's interesting in the sense that it's deliberative, that it's open to cases from all over the world, that those cases will be proposed by people. And the first round, some of the cases were really interesting. I mean, the Goebbels case is probably the most fascinating of all of them, far more interesting than the Trump case to me.
Sorry, which one?
The Joseph Goebbels case. I think Amarnath can probably talk about it better. But it's, I do think let's try these experiments, but I'm really wary of seeing this as a panacea. And I think that the US lawyers that came up with it did it in a really American way that doesn't sit right with me.
Twitter had an interesting solution too, right? Didn't they come up with like a five strikes you're out thing recently? I think that was their kind of approach to it as well, and which is interesting because I think that was always the tension with some of these platforms is if you put an LTT flag up or you put an ISIS flag up as your profile picture, they'll take down your entire profile. But if you tweet an ISIS flag, they'll suspend you or they'll take down that one tweet. So it's this bizarre thing of your profile picture becomes your identity, and therefore your entire identity can be deleted. So that's another kind of approach that they took to Trump as well, is to kind of flag his tweets, to blank out his tweets for a while, which I do think are interesting strategies that could be used instead of a permanent lifetime ban, which is if a particular tweet violates their terms of service, you could just delete that tweet or something, as opposed to a permanent ban. Which I guess I guess these platforms are also trying out different things in many ways too. So, and
just to stay with you, I think there's obviously this trade-off, or that we talked about before, between on one hand, you're pushing people into private and maybe encrypted groups, which could be worrisome, but on the other, you're denying them all of this ability to recruit. And it sounds like in the case of ISIS, at least if I'm sort of interpreting you right, you think that trade-off was worth it. I think the other thing that ISIS was certainly doing on social media, and that the far right does on social media, really is getting access to the mainstream media. And I think so much of the amplification of their message came through us. And I am curious, again, and I'm sorry to keep pulling you back to ISIS. It's just what I've read you on so much. But both in that case and really as you've seen the far right and other things go forward, what you see as that dynamic as where this sort of deplatforming from the social media platforms spills into or interacts with sort of deplatforming from the mainstream media platforms, from legacy media.
Yeah. I think that took a while for a lot of mainstream journalists to realize that, maybe we don't want to do this, right? Because I do think there was a unique aspect to ISIS media in particular that terrorist media became sexy for a while because, a couple of years ago, you used to have to basically wait for bin Laden's courier to bring down a grainy VHS video, and then it became this tablet of gold, like, oh, a terrorist propaganda, whereas with ISIS, it was like 300 pieces of content every day were getting splashed across all kinds of media. And so I think journalists, researchers, analysts for a time became like, oh, we have access to much more terrorist content. Let's learn about what they're saying. And so there was in the beginning, 2012, 2013, people were, researchers were actually posting videos of ISIS content, and so that took a while for people to be like, oh, maybe we don't want to do this. If they're coming from these kind of fringe platforms and forums that you somehow have access to, don't put it on Twitter, and so that took a learning, a little bit of learning to kind of stop doing that. And then I noticed again that we were doing it with the far right last year. As soon as as soon as these guys were taken off of Facebook and Twitter, and they went on to Parler or Parlay, or however you say it, to Telegram, people, journalists sometimes, as well as researchers, were screenshotting things that they were posting on Parler and then tweeting it out, right? And I was kind of like, if the point is deplatforming, and not having some of this stuff on mainstream platforms, what is the actual point of doing that? And so if there's a news purpose, or if there's a public service, if there's some sort of awareness reason that you're doing that, that's fine. But screenshotting anti-Semitic content from Parler because we kicked them off Twitter and then putting it back on Twitter wasn't particularly useful. And so I do think we're kind of, and this is why I kind of tweeted that lessons learned thread a while back on Twitter, is because I think we're having the same conversations again that we had in 2013, 2014, that we had with jihadist groups, all over again with the far right and QAnon groups. Some of the lessons learned from that period haven't really carried over to the far right. And so, yeah, I do think we have to be careful, because, yeah, some of it is cool, some of it is sexy content. QAnon believes that JFK is going to come back any minute now. Yeah, that you might tweet that and get a lot of retweets, but is there a news value to that? What do we, and so I think being a little bit self-reflective about why we're putting certain content out there as the blue checkmark crowd is useful too.
I mean, is anyone concerned about the sort of like that these folks are going to kind of recede into the shadows and into encrypted shadows, and maybe a smaller number of people doing more dangerous things? Is that something we should be concerned about?
Absolutely. I mean, I think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
Yeah, finish up.
Yeah, I mean, no, I think that's absolutely happening already. I mean, the Gab, Parler, when it was active, Telegram, all of these have become QAnon groups on Telegram have 180,000 followers, and so this idea of the fringe platform, I think, has changed with some of these groups. That they've received just as much of a following on these fringe platforms as before. There is a fear, and I've seen a lot of neo-Nazi content basically being like, we can rope in some of these MAGA folks, right? This kind of middle of the road Trump supporter who's kind of just floundering about. We can kind of rope them into more extreme movements. The extent to which that's happening is unclear, but I think there's definitely neo-Nazi groups out to do that and trying to do that more often. So,
but I think they're two totally separate conversations, because what's happening in the encrypted space is scary and complicated. But I worry more about, a platform like Reddit, which is widely distributed, widely viewed. And whenever you say to somebody, well, what do you look at on Reddit? They say, oh, knitting and football. And, they have this kind of, but it's really easy for people to stumble into conversations that draw them into worlds they wouldn't seek out. And to me, I don't know what the line is between niche, scary communities and how they operate, and quote unquote mainstream platforms that sprinkle in hate speech and bias and and all and it all comes down to, if you talk to the Reddit folks, they say, well, we're just an open platform. We'll take something down if there's a lot of pushback. They finally, I think, what is it, in the fall, they took down R the Donald, which I found hysterically funny. Like, oh great, 3.5 years later, nice. That's some fine activity. But I also think we should talk about Parler, because I think the Parler story is different. I mean, the fact that AWS took down Parler, I find really interesting and didn't get much coverage.
And why is that a problem?
So AWS,
Or is that
AWS
great
is,
that Amazon stepped in and did the right thing?
well, I mean, that's a bunch of servers, right? It's essentially an infrastructure company, and Parler is a platform that theoretically doesn't have good moderation policies. But it seemed like there was a whole bunch of things that could have happened before, like in between, you know, hey, we have a problem with your, and in fact, the CEO, who's since been fired from Parler, now claims that he went to his board, in particular Rebecca Mercer, and said, I want to add moderation, and she said no. So, like, I don't understand, you know, other than there were a lot of people taking down Parler, and AWS kind of followed along. But it's like, if AWS is going to start being responsible for all of the platforms it supports, and everyone's blog and everything that's stored on that, you know, Amazon-owned stack of boxes, that's not a little content moderation challenge. That's a big change.
Do you see that as an issue, Kate? Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I just want to jump in and say one thing. Like, I think a lot of the stuff we're talking about right now is short-term versus long-term thinking, and that includes, you know, the questions around deplatforming Trump. Like, is this the right thing long-term? Same with, I mean, I was thinking about like Milo Yiannopoulos. He got deplatformed a few years ago, and he just came back and was like, "Hey, I'm ready for revenge." So we never know what's going to happen in the long term on this. But as far as the AWS question, I mean, I think that, you know, this is another point where, like, has everyone forgotten that AWS deplatformed WikiLeaks in 2010? While WikiLeaks pretty much still had widespread support.
I had totally forgotten.
Entity.
Yeah,
I totally forgotten.
Wow.
Everything old is new again. And yeah, AWS has been doing this for a long, long time. And it's not just WikiLeaks and Parler. It's also the entire country of Iran. They deplatform. You can't use AWS if you're Iranian because of U.S. sanctions. And so that's the U.S. making a law for a U.S. company on what it can do in another country. So, I mean, I think, like, yeah, it gets attention because it's Parler and because it's the thing of the moment. But this, to me, is a big media problem because the media fails to cover these things until they affect some big-time U.S. person.
Mm-hmm. It's because the media doesn't know what AWS is, and neither do their viewers.
But they should, right? Like, AWS is incredibly important. It's one of the gatekeepers to the internet. Just getting back to my earlier point, it is in one of those weird spots where it's not provision of access to the internet, but it is your ability to create it does give people the ability to create an entire platform. And you don't want some executive at Amazon being able to wake up tomorrow morning and be like, I just don't like you, and shutting down your entire platform. Like, there may have been defensible reasons for getting rid of Parler, but I think it went against what we would want an internet governance system to look like at that level.
I'll only say this: anytime anyone says the media and the word "they" in the same sentence, it kind of makes my head spin, because it's not like there's a secret set of rules. Like, you know, I don't know what the media is that you can speak to it as an entity.
I mean, all I can say that as a person who's like an expert,
I hear BuzzFeed's the media.
As a person who talks a lot about these subjects as an expert, I can tell you that I got 50 media requests during the Trump week, and I normally get 2 to 5. And so there's an obsessive focus that seems to happen.
I think it's very hard to ask struggling people trying to.
He's been Stephen has briefly been deplatformed here. That's what happens when you start criticizing the media. He's back. You're back. You were deplatformed. Sorry. And actually, I think on that note, I think I'm going to wrap up here. And thank you all for this. This was really interesting. I do think that, you know, when you talk to people who are expert in this, as you all are, you are reminded of, like, relatively recent history. Actually, I'm sort of so embarrassed that I forgot the WikiLeaks thing. And I think the ISIS history is so relevant, and, like, a lot of this stuff is just treated. I mean, like, I think all process, whenever you sort of get to kind of a process fight in politics, like, well, what do we think about deplatforming? It always, for 95% of the conversation, just becomes, what do you think of Donald Trump? And everyone will happily switch sides when it's somebody else. And I think, like, it is really valuable just to look at the precedents and at kind of the rules that we're creating without even knowing it. So thank you all very much for that. Thanks for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
Look forward to seeing you in some real place someday.
Barbecue, baby.